You grew up with lemon meringue pie
Yeah.
with the weepy topping, because that's just what happens when you meringue and you're not Kenji or Crust Illustrated. And but I grew up, we always had pumpkin pie, although
Okay.
my uncle always liked this certain pumpkin chiffon pie that was like very light and fluffy, so we didn't really do it.
Oh,
It was
interesting.
usually like one of those and one traditional one. But my family is obsessed with apple pie. Like it was
Really?
that's like, I've heard that there are people that's not their Thanksgiving dessert, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like if I do not bring apple pie, I can just turn around, go back in my car, and go home, because I am not like they're obsessed with apple pie. They always want me to make it, and so I've just been
This is
making
you
it.
since childhood also?
Pretty much since I figured out how to cook, I was making apple pie.
What was your first apple pie?
I feel
What
like
was
I
your
was
first apple pie
probably
recipe?
making like an Ina or a Martha, a very classic kind of like 4 pounds of apples, 2 crust. I love doing a lattice.
Okay.
And it wasn't really, I mean, I think it's kind of hard to mess up. I think the biggest variable, the thing that can
Apple pie is hard to mess up?
well, I
pie
think there's
crust?
so much going on. I think my theory is that 75% of times if a apple pie doesn't taste the way you want it to, it was because it was the wrong apples, or maybe they were a little older and they kind of fell apart. I think it's like when the apples kind of fall apart. But otherwise,
Well, we
it's
can get
kind
into
of
that,
hard
yeah.
to make apples, cinnamon, sugar, and a pie crust taste terrible.
Right. It's not going to taste terrible.
It's
but,
the apple
but-
texture that can ruin things.
Yeah, because a bad pie, it's mostly the texture that ends up ruined. Where because a bad pie, the apples turn to mush, the filling becomes very watery. Like you get like kind of like apple cider just pooling at the bottom, and that makes the crust all soggy. And then a crust though, like because the classic problem, at least when I was at Cooks Illustrated, when we surveyed people. The problem that most people had with crust was that their crust would come out, either it was difficult to roll out, like so they wouldn't be able to make a great crust, or if they made a dough that was easy to roll out, it would be really tough, like it comes out leathery. Which is how, like when I used to try and make pie crust without, when I was a teenager, I'm like my early 20s, and I didn't want to bother actually looking up how things worked, and I just wanted to try it, I would make crust and they would just come out like sheets of leather because I would add way too much water. I was like, oh, it needs more water. I just add a little bit more water to make it workable. And then you end up with something that's more like pizza dough than pie crust, right?
I mean, I feel like the reason why pie dough can be hard to roll out from the fridge, and you're talking about a butter pie dough, because shortening isn't going to be so hard to roll out from the fridge, and
Right.
lard can be a little bit of a mix, but most people are probably using shortening or butter or some combination of. But if you're using an all butter pie crust, shockingly, when it comes out of the fridge, it's going to be as solid as a stick of butter or
Right,
something
right.
close.
Well-
But I just go just a little roll at a time. Roll, turn, roll.
Right.
I think I think that the pie dough, it cracks a lot and people get frustrated when they're trying to roll it out too fast.
Right.
Think about taking it down like a millimeter or a quarter centimeter with each roll, and it
Who
will
has
get there.
patience
You're
for that?
you're going to have patience for it because you're going to have a beautiful pie dough in the end, and it's worth
Right.
doing a few extra rolls and not being impatient, so you can stretch it out into this beautiful even sheet.
Well, I think that is the part that people have difficulty with, is that the dough cracks. And so the temptation is when you're making the actual dough that, because, you get to that phase where all right, so let's talk about pie dough to start with. When you make a pie dough, you get your flour, maybe a little sugar, a little salt, and then you put your fat in there, your butter or your shortening. And
What
you
do
cut
you use,
that butter or
Kenji?
shortening.
What do you-
I do all butter because
I do all butter too.
Yeah, because I like the flavor of butter. Shortening is easier to work with. It'll make for a more tender pie dough if you do it right. But you can get away with all butter with the right technique, right?
I agree. I would
as you
rather
were
have the
saying-
flavor than anything that shortening provides. I want it to taste
Exactly.
like butter.
But when you get to that phase where you're cutting your fat into the flour and you want it to look like pea meal, or you want like butter to be in pieces no bigger than the size of like frozen peas, or whatever description it is, how like depending on what kind of pie you're making, or like maybe you're like snapping it in with your fingers and getting those little flakes. No matter what, you're going to end up with a sort of crumbly, mealy texture, right? And that's what you're looking for. And then you have to push it into a ball. And the idea is that you want it to be very, you don't want to add, so you add a little bit of water to it just to get it to come together into a cohesive ball, right? But you want to add as little water as possible, because the water is like what's going to form gluten and what makes the crust well, that gluten makes it leathery, right? That's what makes it tough. For at least for me, the temptation early on when I was trying to figure out how to make pie dough was like, okay, this is mealy. It's not really coming together into a ball. I know if I try and make this into a ball now and I try and roll it out later, it's just going to crumble and crack, and it's going to give me all kinds of problems. So the temptation then is to just add just a little more water, till it comes together into like a cohesive. Yes, because I grew up. My experience with dough was Play-Doh, right? And I expect everything to act like Play-Doh. Like I want it to be easy to roll out. I want to be able to like shove it into a dinosaur and extrude it into spaghetti. I want to be able to put it into a mold. It's like dough to me is what like Play-Doh is what dough was supposed to feel like to me. And so when I first really started working with pie dough, I was like, this can't be right. Like this doesn't act anything like Play-Doh.
But
so,
sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I made your I do a classic, either pinch, or I love using a pastry blender to cut the butter into flour, and I do I call it like the largest should be the size of small peas. But excuse me,
Petit
you did
pois.
something. Petit pois. Well, I feel like it's just a good guidance that you want like this cornmeal thing. It's something you read in recipes a lot, and usually I get friends texting me the day before Thanksgiving going, "What is a pea-sized meal?"
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Yeah. Exactly. I know. That's what my phone is for. It's for friends texting me with their panic recipe questions. However, I think you did, not just with your vodka pie dough all those years ago, but you did something very cool in your experimenting with pie dough where you kind of threw away the idea of pea-sized bits or cornmeal-sized flakes altogether. And this is probably your most current pie dough, the one where you blend. And so I'm leading in so you can tell everybody about it. I'm setting you up because it's really cool.
So this is the part that I think was actually cooler than the vodka bit. We can talk about the vodka bit in that pie dough recipe.
No, I think this is even cooler, to be honest.
Yeah, so you take like half your flour and all of your butter and you blend it into like a paste. And so instead of having like pea-sized meal or whatever, like you just blend it into a complete paste, and then you add, and you do this in a food processor, and then you add your remaining flour and just pulse it in. And so that way, like your dough ends up, so rather like, the dough structure, rather than having like layers of flattened out bits of butter that are coated in flour, which is sort of like what gives you those flaky layers in a traditional pie, all butter pie dough. Instead, you end up with like layers of flour with like a flour butter paste that is separating the layers. And that flour butter paste does the same basic thing where, the butter steams, it separates the layers, and it turns it into this, the flaky and tender pie crust that you want. But I find at least that it makes the dough a lot more malleable, and it makes the dough almost like Play-Doh, where you can really roll it out easily without cracking.
I definitely noticed that. It was definitely more of a Play-Doh thing. I found it very interesting that like even the dough at room temperature, it didn't get mushy as fast. Because usually you need to keep the dough very cold when you have the butter bits inside. And as soon as it starts warming up, it becomes hard to roll. It becomes a little greasy and sticky. And in my recipes, I always tell people to throw it back in the fridge or the freezer for 5 minutes if you need. I always say it's just too much work and it's too difficult to work with a warm pie dough. But I was surprised the scraps I had from yours out on the counter, even an hour later, were not.
They're just like Play-Doh.
Yeah, they were like Play-Doh. I was playing with them. I made a little snowman and a little snake, a snail.
I want to get your honest opinion on this because I've gotten mixed feedback on this pie crust. So I find for a lot of like first time or real amateur pie makers, they like it because it's real easy to work with. But then I talk to bakers. Like my friend Stella Parks. She has a separate recipe on Serious Eats that's much more traditional.
She does
an all butter crust. That's great.
She's a Dyson pinch. I remember
a Dyson pinch. Yeah, exactly. I've talked with other people who have a lot of experience working with pie dough, with traditional pie doughs like you, who don't like the recipe at all because it doesn't work the way you expect it. The other thing that it's not great at is that if you like decorating your pie crust. Like making like a nice fluted edge or something, it doesn't hold fluted edges very well. It kind of puffs up a little bit and gets a little bit slack. And so if you like a real pretty pie crust, it doesn't do that. So yeah, so give me your honest opinion. Did you have
I feel like I should bring it out from the kitchen, but we'll get to that at the end. I don't want to leave the screen right now. But I found it very easy to work with. I think it's really clever. I like it when you take a very established cooking science and kind of like burn it. I think that's the sort of but like every recipe for everything from, and I'm going to ask you about this in a minute, but for pie dough is going to talk to you about having like visible bits of butter. So what I found is that it was a very it definitely expands kind of in all directions, the dough.
Kind of
It's
puffs a
definitely,
little.
yeah, it puffs. And I definitely lost the definition in the edges. In fact, some of them actually kind of went over the side of the pie pan. They kind of grew out. I felt like it
Oh, wow,
expanded in
okay.
all. At the very end, we're going to brush an egg white on top, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really cool. I've never brushed with an egg white before. I've usually done all eggs, or I've maybe just done yolks if I'm trying to get a darker color. But
Okay.
so I found that the flakes that touched the parts of the crust that touched the egg white topping had nice bigger flakes. The rest of it, it wasn't the same kind of flakes that I'm familiar with for pie dough, like where you kind of have that, I don't know, that croissant-like flake where they're flatter, from those bits of butter. But it was still a very pleasant pie eating experience. It wasn't like, it was a little bit different, but I just mean like it didn't taste heavy, it didn't taste leaden, it didn't taste like a cracker or anything like that. It just had like, it had an
This
all-over
is all a very nice
expansion.
way of saying that you hated it.
No, I absolutely loved it. And I cannot wait to eat more right after this. It was so good. But I remember being like, oh, that did not look coming out of the oven the way it did. It's absolutely, I have like so many pictures on my phone. I'm going to do hopefully by the time this episode's out, very soon, I'm
Which
going
is
to have
before Thanksgiving.
Yes, for Thanksgiving, because I grew up in an apple pie family, so we had to do apple pie. I'm going to have a video demo, and I think you'll see it came out beautifully. It was really, truly a stunning pie.